Well,
Hello,
good
everyone. Thank
morning,
you.
good afternoon,
Oh,
or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining this learning experience brought to you by Snyk. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. Before we dive into today's session, I have just a couple of notes to review with everyone. First, we are recording our session today. So if you miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to watch again later, or if you'd like to share with the rest of your team, we'll be sure to send you an email with a link to access the recording on demand, and you'll get that email right after we conclude this live session today. Now, if you'd like to get involved, there are a couple of ways to do so. First, you can send in your chats on the right side of your screen. So when you find that chat tab, let us know from where in the world you're joining from today. If you have questions for us, we do want you to send those into the Q&A tab, also on the right side of your screen. We've got a couple of polls we'll launch throughout today's program, so keep an eye out for those as they pop up. They'll be here towards the beginning. And finally, we will be selecting two attendees today to win a $50 Amazon gift card. So thank you in advance for all of your chats and your questions. Filling out our post-webinar survey will also make you eligible. So let's dive right on into our topic today. We'll be discussing the promise and perils of AI. And I'm joined today by Edgar Kussberg, Staff Product Manager at Snyk, and Randall Deggs, Head of Developer Relations and Community at Snyk. Randall is actually on the ground at RSA with Snyk today. So Randall, thanks for being our voice from the streets.
thanks for having me. And hello, everyone. It's great to see you all. Thanks for joining a webinar on a Tuesday morning, afternoon, night, I guess, depending on where you are in the world. So as Cody said, I'm actually live with Snyk at the RSA Security Conference in downtown San Francisco. And I thought it'd be fun to kick this off by just getting a sense for how the event's going. So right now I'm actually standing in front of Sandbox VR. So we have a huge Snyk setup in here. We also have a massive presence at the conference, and we've been doing a ton of vulnerability fixing and teaching people a lot about AI security and things like that. And RSA attendees are everywhere. So we're downtown on Market Street, and pretty much everyone with the attendee badge is hanging out at RSA. Now, we're going to go up and this may not work very well, but we're going to do a quick on the street interview. Excuse me. Let me ask you a really quick question. We're doing a live interview for any RSA people. All right. Thank you. All right. Maybe we didn't luck out this time, but thanks for joining. We have a really interesting topic for you today. Edgar, I'm going to hand it off to you, and I will rejoin in a moment back inside the office.
Thank you, Randall. Welcome, everybody. We're super excited to welcome you today at our webinar, where we will talk about transforming software development, and security through AI. And Randall will join us in a couple of minutes live from RSA. I'm from Europe, so as he mentioned, it's morning for San Francisco and California. It's super evening for European, but let's get it started. And before we go into the content, I have just three main questions just to get sort of feeling of the audience and of course of you, how you approach AI. And let's just start with the first question. I'll be super interested to know, do you think that actually AI will surpass human intelligence this year, maybe next year, in short future? There's a lot of talks about AGI or AGI. There's a bunch of tweet between Elon Musk and others. So would be really great to get a feeling of the fox here. You should see now the poll, and you should be able to actually vote. There are two simple answers. Exciting. We have almost even split between yes and no. Let's see who wins. AI wins. Probably AI is voting for itself and says that it will surpass. Maybe not. But we have a lot of security people here, so probably we have a lot of insights on why it will not surpass, because it introduces a bunch of vulnerabilities where we're not ready yet. Yes, it's winning. Let's give it a try. It's 22 answers. It's actually great. So now we're getting to 33%. Towards no, majority says yes. I'm also a true believer in AI, so will be super exciting actually to see where it lands. Let's go to the next one.
Wait. Before we go to the next one, quick question for you, Edgar. When do you think AI is going to surpass human intelligence? Are we talking already, tomorrow, next week, year from now, 10 years from now? What's your prediction?
I'm super bad in that. 1.5 years ago, when the ChatGPT came out, I said, yeah, the next open source model will be in 9 months. It came out in 3, I think, or 2. So I missed it by 3. So if I'm now saying that it will come in 3 years, probably it will be next year. But it's also a very broad question, right? What is human intelligence? I think we didn't even reach our maximum of intelligence. And sometimes I really doubt that all the humanity is kind of intelligent. We have still very, very debated between, engineers who focus only on engineering. We have a lot of DIY people. So there's a lot of gaps between, we don't have humans who know everything. So it's very dependent, like in customer support, for example, and sales and marketing. I think those are very heavily impacted by AI. Developers, I don't even think that, developers should bother about AI. It will be a great enabler, but we will have our job forever. Somebody needs to control these machines.
Sounds good. Well, I can see in the chat, we do have some other interesting guesses. So Erky says 2030. So we'll see what comes true. It definitely is increasing at a very fast pace. All right, you can go to the next question. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. Let's get interactive. So actually, it's interesting. Who of you uses ChatGPT or any other models, right? You can do Claude, you can use Anthropic, whatever, any other models. And how many of you actually do use them or use minimum 1 time, or let's put it minimum 3 times? It's very interesting. How much actually, Randall, you're using it daily, right?
I use it all the time. So in my position here at Snyk, one of the things that myself and my team do is we create a lot of educational content for engineers. And in order to do that, like we're talking about articles and research and tools and things like that. But in order to do that, we do a ton of R&D and experimentation work ourselves. So just to give you a little bit of insight into how we're using it internally today, we built some really interesting automations and tools that have saved us, I think we did the calculations and we saved something like 2,000 hours of human team time over the last year with the tools that we already built. But we're automating our social media. So for example, if we have an event coming up, like RSA is a good example of one, we actually parse all this information from a calendar. We take in information about the event website, what interesting sessions we have happening at the event, things like that. And we take it and we prompt an LLM. I think we're using Claude for this actually currently, like the Opus model, but we actually take it, give it a nice prompt, and we say, hey, please create a social media post, asking people to come and check out the Sneak booth at RSA, for example, or go attend one of our sessions. And we'll basically take all those things. And currently we dump it into a Jira ticket, essentially, that gets reviewed by a human and tweaked if necessary. And then finally, when we drag it into the final Jira column for, done or approved or whatever it is, it actually triggers an automation, which actually queues it up to go out on social media at that particular date and time. So it's been really helpful. We used to have interns essentially doing a ton of this work, but yeah, I'm using it every day and it's been great.
We're just very close to doing demos to customers just with AI, right? So the DevRel can just be their prompt engineering. Oh, that's exciting. Look at this. 90% of people on the webinar actually use ChatGPT or similar on the daily basis. That's super exciting.
So I have a question about this. If you're one of the people in the 11% who haven't used it so far, please drop a message in the chat about why. Like, are you against it? Do you think it's, terrible? Or maybe you've seen other people use it and you're just not impressed? But I'm really curious to see what your particular reasons are, because it's become so ubiquitous. I'm really curious about that.
It might be people from hardware engineering, ChatGPT won't help you to weld the CPU on something or create a new GPU design. That's not really the job it can do. And last but not the least, for me, it would be actually very interesting because we had a lot of debates recently on that in relation to Snyk and to our products and in general. is actually, if we talk about AI, all of you know that AI only gets better as much data you can give it. And then you have this question about like, are you ready actually to share your data, or in particular code? I'm not talking about like open source, but actually your proprietary code that you wrote for actually getting a better user experience. It might be better suggestions, for fixes. It might be better written tests. It might be better documentation because it knows your language of other things that you're doing, or even, I know actually, Randall, you're creating a lot of demos. Is actually AI helping you to write great code or great demo examples?
I think so. I mean, I've been programming for about 25 years. I'm not sure how long everyone, in this call has been into this stuff, but one of the things that I found really helpful is I think AI, for the most part, like actual generative AI in a coding companion sort of relationship, has just made programming way more fun for me personally. So I used to essentially take the approach of, let's say I'm working on a project, could be a new thing, could be an existing thing, doesn't really matter. My typical workflow is I'd read through the documentation. I would go to Google and search for very specific things if I didn't know them and try to figure out like what to do here or what to do there. I'd go to Stack Overflow and probably spend a bit of time toying around with other people's solutions and testing things out. Nowadays, my flows entirely changed. I'll use what I'm personally using lately actually is a tool called Codium. So it's a plugin for VS Code that lets you work with different models. And you can just prompt it and say, hey, please add this method into this file, and it should do these things. And it will inline in the editor actually show you those things in real time. And it's great. It takes away a lot of that boilerplate research that I was doing before. And it's just been really fun.
Actually, it's interesting. How much of this code are you actually changing after it's generated?
I still end up changing things a decent amount and tweaking. Like I haven't really seen it get to the point where, you can just have like an autonomous coding agent, for example, like that big Devin thing that was really popular a couple months back. I haven't really seen anything like that work in the wild just yet, but I'm sure eventually we'll get there and it'll be amazing.
Yeah, that's exciting. We actually have literally 50-50. So there's a half of people who are ready to share their data to make AI better for them and actually make it, the suggestions of AI better. I saw personally when I use Copilot, I use it every day. And the issue I have that it literally doesn't get to the point where I would actually just write something that I want. It will generate code and I'm like, amazing, PR, push, go. And then somebody will approve it and go. It's still like, it accelerates you to start, but then you still need to do all the heavy lifting of like changing it, adding libraries, checking, are these libraries secure or not? Is there already some, utils for doing some specific methods or like encryption, whatever? So it doesn't solve all the stuff. Oh, look, it changed a bit. So it actually relies, it's the same numbers as we had on the question about AI surpassing human intelligence. So probably this 52 people here are also believing that AI can actually help us even more. Yeah, almost 55-45 and then 52-48.
Wow.
Exciting times we're living in.
By the way, Andrew asked a really good question in the chat. He said, which like developer-centric AI models have you reviewed? So far, I'm looking at GitHub Copilot and AWS Code Whisperer, which I believe is using Claude behind the scenes. But Edgar, which tools have you played around with? Which ones do you like?
I used also Codium, the one that you said. I tried Code Whisperer. I tried Gemini recently. It's great experience holistically with Gemini because it's all interconnected in itself. It's not that you have some ID and then you put some plugin and then you just like dump it. I used, of course, Copilot, but recently they changed the licensing, so it's not free anymore. And in the beginning, there were a bunch of things with Copilot that were worrying me, in particular, like when we have our tooling in place and then when code is generated, and then immediately I see some vulnerabilities like indicated, because vulnerabilities appear when you are actually adding them to your project and not when the code snippet is generated. There's obviously in the snippet there's not a lot of vulnerabilities happening. Where it happens, where you have taint vulnerabilities, for example. Great, so let's get it going. We have two parts of the presentation that we'll be going through. The first part will be probably more generic, but I want to set up the scene that we all are on the same page. And then the second part of the presentation, we will actually go with Randall together through an AI report or survey that we did with a lot of our customers, where we talked with them about their developers, their security teams, how they're adopting AI, what are they using, what challenges they see with that. So let's get started. Very interesting moment where I get a lot of ahas is actually that people believe that LLMs appeared last year, where I'm saying like, hey, they're actually for more than 5 years already. Now, like, the first model was T5. Snyk acquired a company called DeepCode here from Zurich, where I'm located, where actually we use T5 code model. This like optimized model of T5 for coding specifically. And actually, there's a lot of models happened. And this was exactly as in the beginning, Randall, we discussed that the speed with which new models are appearing today is enormous. I think every 2 weeks, I get some ping in my Feedly list with like some new startup or some new company raised money for launching yet another LLM model for, the recent one about GPT-2, where nobody knows who is this person and what is this model from. Is it actually GPT-5 from OpenAI? Is it not? So a lot of talks there. Llama and Facebook introduced quite super impressive developments that they had in the recent 6 months or something with their presentation a couple of months ago, where it was just blowing away all the benchmarks and also the features that they're introducing, with more like this awareness of that AI should be secure. You should be the owner of the model should also take responsibility that the model generates secure outputs, not just in terms of code that you don't have vulnerabilities, but also that the text and the outcomes that the model is generating are actually truth, right? So in terms of gender neutrality and a lot of other things. Interesting part though, if we go back a bit into our world of developers, that's why we're here today, also relevant to the RSA, is that with all of these new tools, now it's here Bard, sorry for my outdated picture here, now it's called Gemini, and ChatGPT and Copilot and Code Whisper, and GitLab is also building their own stuff connected to OpenAI. Now developers, it almost feels they got superpowers. They can go 10 times faster. But then I believe, although these features, they help you with some sort of boilerplate code generation, they appear beneficial for developers, but actually they contribute minimally to improving security, actually making the code more secure and removing the vulnerabilities. And just as this tool streamline efficiency, AI is set, to revolutionize time-intensive tasks. But, writing queries, documentation, tests, whatever. But in the context of security, we have this gap because security teams now suddenly have 10 times more code to review, more PRs, but the teams don't scale that fast. So you end up kind of be blocking developers, which then actually amplifies the problem we have between developers and security. Although we have all the DevSecOps motion, it still kind of puts more oil into the fire, so to say. An interesting number is that when we did this survey, it's actually 72% of people said that AI code suggestions was making them, or their teams, but depends, we had both developers and engineering leads and CTOs and a bunch of other people, somewhat or much more productive. So I believe people see that, you can't fight AI. You should find a way to collaborate with that. And actually, we have a bunch of companies who we talked at our event in New York a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of CISOs and CTOs said, yes, we actually allowed our developers to use any AI code suggestion tool, but in a combination with some security tooling. For example, if you enable Snyk plugin, then you can actually enable Copilot, and then you can kind of balance this out. Now, if we talk about the generation of code, the usual pipeline is you have development, you have some IDs, you have SCM, you have CI/CD pipelines, you have some registry of your internal packages, and then of course you have your production and staging environments. So, and there's a lot of discussions about how do you actually treat AI generated code, and do you need to identify this code because it might be super vulnerable and, I don't know, super bad quality, etc. Whereas we early in the stage, we actually said that we don't believe there's any use or value of differentiating between the code generated by human or code generated by AI, because you train AI on code that was written by humans, So the only thing it can do is can replicate us. And if we produce bad code, I mean bad in terms of security and quality and everything, AI is no different. And that's why where we see AI is actually, it's almost like embedded into the IDE workflow. So it just helps developers produce more code. It doesn't automatically land in production. I know, Randall, what's your opinion there? It would be great because you're more closer to developers. How do that side of equation sees that?
I mean, I think you pretty much nailed it. The most important thing really is just giving developers tools that are really easy to use so that they don't really have to think as much about security in their organization. I think that's really what it comes down to. So, I've worked at organizations before as an engineer where essentially the way that I interacted with security was, a couple times a year, the security team would run a huge scan across all the different applications that we were building. They would essentially get like a big Excel spreadsheet of every vulnerability that was detected by these scanning tools. And there would literally be hundreds of thousands of lines in the spreadsheet. And it would just say something like project name, file name, line number, and a one sentence description of the vulnerability. And for the next year, the security team at the company would essentially just chase down engineers from different teams, trying to figure out who can take a look at this vulnerability to see, first of all, is it a real thing? Second of all, can you fix it? Does that mean upgrading a dependency? Does it mean changing some code or doing things? And it just became this extremely tedious, slow process that everybody dreaded, both in security and engineering. And nowadays, if you're using tools like Snyk, it's just so much easier because you can get this stuff directly in your IDE. So nowadays, I literally will just use VS Code to write some software, and I don't even really think about security that much. I get the little Snyk security warning under some stuff that I'm writing, and I just click, fix this with AI, and bam, things are good to go. And so it's a much nicer process for sure.
I don't remember actually who told me that, but I loved this thing when I was actually developer and I was a team lead. We all the time said that velocity is king. And it doesn't matter what you're giving me for tools. I don't compromise on velocity. I want developers to actually be shipping value to the user as fast as possible. But at the same time, stay secure, great quality code, good amount of documentation that, you can actually go and improve your code later on.
So
a part of that.
Actually, real quick, Edgar, before we move on, Steve C had a couple good questions. So I'm just going to relay those to you and get your thoughts. All right. So
yep.
Let's start with this one down here, actually. With techniques like data poisoning, attackers may be able to trick AI into providing biased and gullible responses. What approaches should be added in order to mitigate these types of attacks? Do you have any thoughts on that, like during the training phase, for example, or
yes, it's actually quite interesting. Yeah. So I believe data poisoning will be is actually a huge topic because, if you're having the live loop from the prompts and feedback that users are giving you, and you're kind of saving all of that data just bluntly to your training data set, and then you're retraining your model, then obviously it's super hard actually to understand in which shape your model is. And for general purpose knowledge, this is actually biggest issue that you have. Now, if you take, for example, our models that we developed ourselves, in the group that I was leading, it's actually a bit different. We're actually curating our training data set ourselves. We have a quite heavy, or not heavy, let's say we're quite stable and established labeling process where we actually have a bunch of security experts who actually help us to understand where the fixes produced by the model are good or bad, etc. And then it would actually rate the fix, and then everything what's above specific benchmark, then we know that these fixes are to X degree good, so we will just move it forward. But then the other ones will be actually visualized to the people, and they will actually review those, and then we will actually add them to our training data set. We're not directly, for example, adding some feedback of customers directly into our training data set. Neither we actually trained any of our models on the customer's data. We actually sourced a lot of open source repositories and a lot of open source historical data on understanding what we can learn from and how we can improve our models to generate secure code.
Well, Steve, I think that answers your question. So thanks for submitting. And by the way, if any of you are watching this and have questions you want Edgar to answer, please drop them in the Q&A tab, and we'll make sure we get those over to you. All right.
It's also,
Edgar,
by the way,
back to
very
you.
different between, yes, it also depends very much on the interface of your model, right? For example, with ChatGPT, you just have a talking interface with the model. So you can go, and there's a great tool called Gandalf, I think. It was actually kind of the wizard who was holding a secret, and you need to try to actually get him to give you the secret, and then you can go through the levels, and every level adds more and more security guardrails of what can actually LLM tell you, what LLM can't tell you, and then you can trick it out into various things. I got to level 4 or 5, and then actually I just gave up because my prompt engineering skills are not that great. But yeah, there's a lot of, actually, this is my next slide, and this is a great question to do the move. So I think there are 4 main risks that we believe are important, both for developers to understand, but also like for security people. And the first that I already probably mentioned, that AI generated codes quality, and reliability may vary due to training, for example, on incomplete or biased data sets, on vulnerable code. And also somebody says this is a negative part. I call it AI creativity, which is actually hallucinations, where models just come up with some patterns that they saw in other sites, or for example, non-existing packages. Or for example, I wanted to optimize something in my Substack. I wanted actually to do like a curation of my blog and do some kind of automations. And then I asked ChatGPT to generate that code, and actually everything was nice. So from code-wise, it looked amazing. It called some APIs, called some endpoints, till the moment I realized that Substack has no API. And I was like, why this code was generated? Why didn't tell me that there's no API? And I actually spent almost like half an hour looking where I can generate an API key for Substack. And then I figure out there is no API. It's just like it thought of like, look, all other services who have API, they have this thing called REST. In REST, you have this format of endpoints. This is how it goes. Now, the second one is one of my favorite ones. One of the top 2 is actually the blind trust, where I imagine myself, huge corporation, you have some junior developer who got a ticket to change something in the code. He will actually go and ask Copilot or I don't know, ChatGPT or any other LLM model or Codium to actually change the code. And then it will change it. And then on the other side, whenever I will create a PR, there's another junior developer, my buddy, who started with me together 1 month ago. I will ask him to review my code. And he will use the same model to review the code. And of course, the model will not say that the code that he generated is actually insecure. So you will have sort of the bias inside of the generation of the code and also the review. So we're always trying to tell our people who are talking to you about AI and in general like about code assistance is that you should be trying to utilize 2 different providers of models, the one for actually generating code and another one for actually testing it for security, quality, or any other metrics that you want to have. Third one is obvious probably for everybody. AI is learning from code that we write, and nobody of us is saint. We all introduce vulnerabilities, some more severe, some less severe. But there are multiple studies, already show that, although all of this code assistance can generate code, but it only sees some basic vulnerability flows in the generation. But then when you add this code into your project, you have a bunch of taint vulnerabilities appearing because suddenly you have complete new data flows, and that leads to complete new use surfaces like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and much more. And the last but not the least, I think somebody wrote also in chat, is about IP violation, because I'm allowed to use code. In the beginning, probably a year ago, when it generated code, it didn't even give you sources of where did the model find the samples. I always tell people that you should check this, but it shouldn't be the blocker for adopting AI, because you can't prevent your developers going to Stack Overflow or copying some code. This is already like violation in some terms, but developers still do that. And any developer who tells you he doesn't go to Stack Overflow, he doesn't copy code from there, I would bet he does, or she. It doesn't matter who. And yeah, so let's reduce the theoretical part and go to actually why we're here. It's all of discussing our insights from our AI code security report. It says 23. It was in December, I think, or something, somewhere around that where we started, and now we are getting the results. So we asked about 500 companies from startups, mid-large companies who we have also a lot of enterprise customers who we talked to, and we also didn't want to make it only like one-sided, like developers saying how amazing code assistants are because they're 50% more productive, whatever, but also talk about IT teams who are actually maintaining all of these tools and security. We didn't ask finance. Probably there will be a bit getting gray here after they get the first invoice from OpenAI or GitHub or any other provider, because it's quite expensive. When I calculated what it gets to, like when you have thousands of developers, it's quite pricey. Like IDE license costs are not even standing, on the side of it.
Just to give people a better understanding of that, I mean, we've done some interesting experiments and things like that with OpenAI's GPT-4 in the past. How much money would you say we've spent on just toying around with these things, at least that you're aware of, Edgar?
I need to put a bet. I mean, I know our invoices from OpenAI, so
give us an approximate number, something in the ballpark. You could do a range. You could say between 100 and 200,000, right? But like, I think it's very interesting, right? Like how much money is actually going into this stuff for real world usage.
It's actually between tens and hundreds of thousands. Like depends on the domain that we used. It's literally very broad. In particular, when we were trying to train the model and actually provide high curated training or generate a high curated training data set, it's super expensive. Of course, if you create a model to differentiate, I don't know, apples from bananas or like all sorts of fruits, probably you can get it much cheaper because one label will cost you a couple of cents. But in our use case, and particularly in security, where you need actually security experts to look at your data and kind of pick it and say like what is good, what is bad, we're talking about like ballpark of hundreds of thousands of dollars to both like generate data, because you need to run all the GPU training and etc., but also on curating the data, which is even more tiresome process than just like starting some, I don't know, GPT-3 model or 3.5 and then training it with some embeddings or whatever. So let's
super interesting.
So I'm waiting till all of the CFOs etc. will actually raise a question about like, what is the budget for AI in 2025? Is it the same? Is it higher? Is it lower? Like the spendings probably will go quite high. For this year, a lot of companies got some kind of high ballpark because you couldn't actually navigate that. So you got sort of carte blanche on that. But I think in the next year, the question will be like, what is the ROI on our investment in AI? And this is where big question will start. Like, is it performance? How secure it is? Do we have more vulnerabilities? Do we have more features shipped? How do you measure all this? And let's just start with the first question, which is super interesting, is we asked actually how often do developers bypass security policies in their companies to actually use AI? Because we thought it's not really that every company allows any tooling, and developers still code in their free time on various other hobby projects and open source, etc. So probably they will have a second laptop or maybe the same laptop but with different users. And it's super interesting actually that shows that restricting the usage of AI doesn't really work. So you have here more than 55% who actually just go around the policy and open the browser or open it on a different machine, and people will find a way to use tech that reduces work for them because it makes them faster. And we believe that the solution to here is actually to combine policy that aligns with the way that people work, but then adding also the security guardrails to actually keep them in this kind of shape. So for example, adding IDE scanning for vulnerabilities or for quality checks, quality guardrails. And then you kind of combine the two benefits there. Another interesting fact here was that, if your organization restricts the usage of AI coding tools, what's the reason for that? Like, we don't see any reason, but obviously there are. We mentioned it a couple of minutes ago about the risks that come from that. And it was kind of, we expected this, but we didn't think that it will be actually number one, but it's actually security concerns. And the second one is obvious. We learned it from various use cases, where I remember, I think it was Samsung, where their developer leaked their production keys to ChatGPT, and somebody was like, oh, Samsung keys, let's try to use it. And then it got quite significant press there. So I think privacy and security in total, this is the biggest question for AI, but not just in developer world, but like overall. It's like, for example, if I'm a newspaper, I saw here in Switzerland, we had it quite for a while, where they were actually telling that AI shouldn't be learning from their content, because newspapers spend significant amount of money to actually produce this content, and pay for interviews for their interviewers, and for travel, and for everything, to keep high quality content. And then somebody comes and calls, Reddit, for example, they added their pricing to their APIs. Stack Overflow does the same. So now the data is still king. Now somebody needs actually to go and curate it and understand it. So what does it lead to us? Developers are using tools for AI code generation and testing, etc., despite the fact that their companies are sort of blocking for them. But what's actually the cost? So is Gen AI actually supercharging developers at a cost of security? Maybe. So what we get here is more code, right? More code lead to more speed. This is probably the two that you, Randall, love the most. But then probably what you love less is actually that leads automatically to more vulnerabilities, right? So now from that all, we actually asked our survey is actually how often, the developers and teams encounter security issues when they generated some code. And interesting, like 59% of AppSec teams are struggling to keep up with the whole like new amount of PRs and new number of code generated. And yet I think I remember what was the number, but only like 10%, I think, are actually spending significant time in understanding how they can automate security early in the process. Like this whole shift left motion, it's still not mature in every company. It's like companies are moving there, and it's not working well. Like you can't just scan them in somewhere like, I don't know, in Jenkins, and rely that all of this huge amount of code that is now suddenly generated that will catch everything at the end. And then you will need to roll back, you need to fix everything, you'll have a lot of pressure there. And all of the tooling, I think you, Randall, said before that all their tooling is not fast enough. So security teams are small, more code reviews, and it's just like, it's impossible to keep up there. And
yeah, I mean, the gist of what you're saying basically is every developer, or a lot of developers, are starting to use AI to write code. And the net of that is that they're generating more code faster. And that means with any code, there's generally more security risk. And so the question becomes, how do you ensure that the code that's being generated more quickly is also secure, right? Is that sort of the root of it?
I think they're both, like security, quality, all of these aspects, that you're not blocking it for not using AI. You need to enable AI. But then you just need these guardrails that will help your developers to actually just focus on delivery. But at the same time, actually stay secure, stay great in terms of quality, documentation, testing, and everything around that. Another interesting part was actually about how many of AppSec teams are struggling to adopt with the speed of development due to AI code completion. And here again, we saw like 60% or 59% of AppSec teams are literally said, like with the tooling they have today, it's literally impossible. Like they need to go to the IDE to provide all the guardrails in the IDE, because this is the place where now you have much more code. So even just like relying that every PR will be secured, that doesn't help, because as soon as code is in SCM, it's inside of the PR, somebody will need to check it. So it means that security will still be triggered on the PR. But as long as it's done in your IDE and you have, you just add, I don't know, Codium, for example, as a plugin in VS Code, if you would just add Snyk as a plugin there, then actually you will have code that will land in SEM will already be kind of pre-checked with a security tooling. And then you will actually already have significant lower load on your security team, and then they will be also happy with that. Absolutely. Now, the interesting part here was that we asked also, how concerned are you about the broader security implications? Because one thing is just security code and vulnerabilities, but there's also a bigger amplitude of that. For example, we have security teams struggling, and like 80% developers are bypassing policy safeguards actually to use these tools. Yet it actually seems not much being done to secure the AI itself, right? So like we know a lot of models that you can use and self-host. You can just take from Hugging Face, and then you can just host a code generation model yourself. But then how do you actually secure all of that? So I think on the other side, it's also added some new surfaces where you need to look at. In particular, if your teams or companies are developing your own AI models, is actually to look into how you're training it, what training data set includes. The question about data poisoning was exactly that. How can you secure yourself from prompt injection? If you're using tools like LangChain, and then you can actually, or you allow the tool to execute something in CLI, how you can actually guardrail that whatever command the model has generated is actually secure. So it's, here's actually significant amount of things or concerned about AI security tooling that we have today. I know at Snyk, we also did this exercise, right? We have a quite big AI ML team group where we are training our models. We're having our training data set, and we need to create the data. We need to retrain the models. We need to benchmark them. And then even though it's internal, we still need to understand what are you pulling from Hugging Face? Are there any scripts added to actually running the model? Because as soon as you run the model, you can also have some additional scripts that are running. And there are some, controls from Hugging Face that you can add, for example, that it doesn't load any additional files, but it still can run a model, and then there will be some script that will load some external resource and run it on your machine. And then voila, you could leak, for example, your AWS credentials. This is like the most probably basic example. And if we go now, like as a summary, what we actually want to let people know from what we learned is that 56% of people that we talk to still say that AI suggestions are insecure, and this is a common thing. It's not that AI suddenly starts to generate secure code only. It's not a holy grail of secure coding. 80% of them said that they are just bypassing security company policies to use AI because they know they're faster. If they do their work faster, then this is what developers actually are thriving for. 87% are concerned that then security on the other side actually indicates sort of cognitive dissonance, because it's not more secure, but then you still want to use it, and it's like a strange thing. And AI is now actually considered as part of your supply chain, but there's actually not many things are changing. So for example, like this training data set, how do you create this? How do you understand that nobody actually added some data to your training data set that would actually leak something? Or for example, if you use ongoing training, how do you know that you don't have any data from your company, for example, financials, that won't leak into your training data set, that nobody will get it? So, and also, for example, if your company tries, for us was, we are trying to do also benchmarks against other models that are out there from like open source community. You use Hugging Face a lot. And then how do you actually assure that whenever you pull a model and you start it, it's almost the same as you pull a package from NPM or from any other, package management system? We currently scan those packages, and then we know that one are secure, others might have a vulnerability, etc. So there's no tooling currently that does the same for AI to actually assess how secure is the model, what do I need to look at with the model, which data it was trained on, etc., etc. And last but not least is actually that the AppSec teams are struggling to keep up. And despite we're in the beginning of the AI journey, I would not say we're even like in the early majority. We're still like in very early phases of that, and there will be a huge gap between all of this let's say, new startups who pave the road for our AI can do this and our AI can do that. I believe over the next year, we will see that will be just kind of couple or maybe like a dozen of those who actually do something very significantly different and significantly valuable for the society, for the developer community, and for security in particular. And I wanted actually to showcase something. Or Randall, do you have anything to add on the learning side before I jump into one example from actually internal from Snyk? Do you have anything to add here?
No, this looks great to me. I guess I was answering some questions a moment ago. We had some good questions, but I think I answered all of them in the chat. So if you do have another question, feel free to drop it in. But
yeah, or you can also use the Q&A, so we can actually easier.
Or yeah, in the Q&A, sorry.
Curate them there. So, but what I wanted actually to give you a bit of like sneak peek behind, the scenes is we had this idea in the early of the last year of 2023, where we were thinking about we're super great in finding vulnerabilities. And for me as a developer, and Randall probably the same, is it doesn't really help that you show me that I have 500 vulnerabilities in my project. It's great to know, but like it doesn't motivate me to go and spend next 3 months on fixing all of these vulnerabilities. It's a great thing to know. It's amazing information, and we should definitely action on this. But we thought, what if we could go further than finding vulnerabilities and actually automatically fix vulnerabilities for developers? So we actually started quite simple, and we thought of it, what are the components for success here? And number one, we figure out, as we mentioned before, tons of data. We need a lot of data to model at all to start producing something useful. And more the better, but it should be relevant information. So just dumping a bunch of stuff that you have doesn't help you if you don't know what the outcome of the model should be. Second one, we briefly mentioned that labeling power is super important. So whenever you have general purpose knowledge, it's easier for you because every label of your training data set will cost you a couple of cents. And more vertical you're going, for example, for us, it's like security of code. This is very specific data points that we need to gather, and this will increase the price per label. So like we pay like hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually to train and get the training data set in a shape that we can actually train our models on. And the last but not the least, probably the thing that costs more than any fancy supercar on the planet, from Bugatti to whatever, Ferrari, McLaren, etc., is you need an army of GPUs. And who of you follow and invested in NVIDIA 3 years ago, probably you can retire. Unfortunately, it was not me.
Yeah.
But nowadays, GPUs are very needed, and we had also struggled with getting access to the GPUs, and also to allocate time for training the models, retraining them, benchmarking, running, all of that. But then what we actually went into,
Edgar, let me ask you a question on behalf of the audience about this. So one of the questions I hear pretty often when talking to people about sort of how we're building our own models and how we're sort of securing AI generated code, people are always very curious about, where do we get our tons of data from? Are we pulling it from open source projects on GitHub? Are we analyzing customer repositories? Are we using other like indexes of, open source indexes of crawlers and things like that? Like, where does a lot of this data originate, would you say?
So something that sets us apart from the early beginning of Snyk. I need to put it somewhere. It's a new word, Snyks. Snyk, we actually put it a statement that we're not using any of our customers' data for training our models. What we do, or where we get the raw data for training, is actually we are scanning a lot of open source projects. Then we always try to find the license file. In the license file, we're checking out what is the license for this specific repository. And then depending on the license, then we actually decide, should we actually take this repository or this code and actually add it historically to our, let's say, data set. It's not yet training data set. It's just a data set of some code. And then we take this code, and then we actually run it, we analyze it with our deep code AI engine for our static analysis. Then we find vulnerabilities. And then the interesting part there that I will show in the next slide was that whenever we have this vulnerable code, so imagine we have a huge repository with a bunch of vulnerabilities. And then when we actually started pushing all of that data into a model, and the first open source models that were there a year ago, they were quite small. So we figured out that the more data you're pushing into training and more generic it is, less accurate the model becomes. So if you're just dumping like hundreds of megabytes of code into a model and you try to train it actually to fix code, it actually generates by far worse examples as if you actually reduce the code towards the vulnerable snippets and then you ask them to generate a snippet of fixed code. Because then you don't have, you have very specific context. And then through that, the quality of the fixes and the models is much higher. So what we did exactly this. We took a lot of, our data set. We took a model off the shelf. We actually tried to, reduce all of these vulnerabilities. Then we had these vulnerable snippets. We generated a huge data set. And then we asked the model, hey, here's, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, like in short, small snippets. Can you please generate fixes? And the model generated for us this fix candidate, so-called. And then what we did is that's why we call it hybrid AI, because we're combining people or humans with actually our technology, where we validate those fixes with our static analysis engine. And then we know, okay, this, for example, fix is valid, other fixes are not valid. So we will just remove them from the data set. And then if not, we will mark them, green or red, super simple. And then actually afterwards, we will visualize those to an analysts. And our security analysts will kind of start, labeling which are the good fixes, which are the bad fixes. And depending on that, actually, we will create our internal benchmark of what is the degree of kind of, degree of or assumption, what if the fix candidate is actually secure. And then we will just add them to the training data set manually, or we will actually ask analysts to label this data. So it's both. We still have this kind of, if our, analyzer thinks that, yes, it's 80% or 85% that this fix was actually good, then we will actually bypass the analyst, and then it will go directly to the training data set. Everything what's below 85 and above, I don't know, let's put a random number, 30 or something like this, then this fixes will actually go to the analyst to actually do the labeling manually. And more data we go through analysts, better our analyzer gets, so we can better assess the validity of the fixes. But this is the whole very high level process of how we did that. It took us quite a while to actually build all of the bits here. But this is sort of behind the scene of how deep code AI fix works there. So takeaways. I want to not just talk about what we do, but also actually about what you can take from here. Is I believe there's no way you can fight against AI. It will come, and better you find a way to work with it. And on that front, it's super important to actually create education and awareness for both, your leadership, for your developers, for your team leads, for your security people, IT. Write up policies. You can even use ChatGPT to write an AI policy for your company, which is fun. But it actually generates a good policies because a lot of people ask ChatGPT to generate those. So it knows exactly what to put there. And then also around AI usage. And as Randall said, it's super easy for developers to just go to one specific page internally, I don't know, Confluence or Notion or whatever, and actually understand, okay, what tools are available or Okta or whatever you use. And then actually just pull what's allowed and then just try it out and then experiment. And more you experiment, better understanding you will get actually also which tool is better for you, where you can go deeper and maybe provide some more data, share data, and then get more better results. Then focus on security vulnerabilities, data and human interactions. I don't think AI is in a shape where, as Randall said, you will just ask the agent and it will generate you the whole PR with all the fantastic code, with all the functionality and UI and backend and I don't know, Terraform file and whatever. And then it will just automatically be deployed. Probably no code, low code was here. What is it now? 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I remember people were saying developers will be jobless. Now we have no-code, low-code tools. Every business person will now be able to build any products, any applications, whatever. We're still here, and I don't think AI is there to replace us. It's a great enabler, though. And the last one is actually make education actionable and make sure that both mistakes and best practices are written down somewhere, and people can actually go back and refer to those and actually learn from each other. This is super important. And on the other side, of course, don't trust but verify. So it means like treat AI code like it's you just hired 10 times more people and you want to actually to speed up your organization. Put security guardrails. So as we mentioned in our talk, ID is probably the battlefield of 2024 for a lot of companies. You see, everybody pushes some plugins in the ID. And if you look at like activity of plugins in the last 5 years, it was quite low. And now like with the AI, it's just like explodes. And
I think it's almost like the iPhone App Store, right? Like everybody wanted an iPhone app, and now everybody needs a VS Code plugin. Basically, it's like our generation's version of this.
Yeah, I think this is quite great. It's actually when the App Store opened up to any developer who can develop an app. Remember in the beginning, they had this preset of apps, and then they created this whole SDK and all the stuff. And now you can actually download Xcode. You can write the first apps. This is very, Randall. That's why we have here. It's like to the point. But then at the end, it's exactly this. Like you should take generative AI tooling and then combine it with separate models for actually checking the validity or security or quality of it. And if you have the two together, provided to developers, they will love you. And this is the only important thing, right? That developers love security, security love developers, and we all are successful. Anyway, I see we have 4 minutes left. I think we did some questions on the go, but I see we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A, so maybe.
Yeah, so I'll pick out one. I think we have time for maybe just this last one, but Steve had a good question, a follow-up from earlier, which is, AI is very useful in a lot of situations, even things like education, right? Especially for self-study courses where you're learning new things, it can really help you. However, it could make people get too used to relying on AI for common information. And Steve basically said it's similar sort of to the revolution of calculators, right? Like people don't really do math that much anymore. They're plugging everything in there. So question for you, Edgar, is do you believe we should restrict students' use of AI? And let's keep it sort of scoped to like primary school, maybe, just to make it a little bit simpler. But what's your opinion on the usage of AI in primary school?
I love taking my phone out, opening ChatGPT, and asking my daughter, let's write up a story. And then I will ask her, like, what characters do you think the story has? And then she will explain me something. I will just be writing because she can't type. She's 7. I will type, the story has following characters, blah, 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 blah. And then I would ask her, what do you want the story to be about? And then she will tell me something and I will add it there. And then I will just ask ChatGPT to generate a story. Boom. You have a personalized bed story, and you can do it every day with a completely new story. And this is freaking amazing. Now, should that be applied to your bachelor thesis or to your master degree? Oh, by the way, my master thesis was seven or 6 pages. I brought it to my professor, and he looked at me and asked me, like, what is this? Is the marketing brochure? I said, like, no, it's actually what I did. And then he asked me to expand it, and I took this to my wife, who was actually studying economics, so she's great in writing. And I asked her, can you please write 23 pages more? So he expanded that. It didn't add any value, like it was just water. But because you have these rules at university that it should be minimum of 22 pages, this is how I got, my studies through. So it doesn't mean that AI is not helpful. I think AI can't do a lot of things that we humans do, in particular creativity. And actually to go there and do like hard code research, experimenting with things. For me, it was like I was building an iOS app for a job portal, which actually back in the days, there was nothing like that. Why would I go and like download an app for searching for a job? Right now, we just use LinkedIn on the phone to search for a job. But back in the days, you couldn't even ask it. So I think AI gives a lot of food for thought. But as you said, you generate the boilerplate, but then actually you do still a lot of tweaking. So I believe even if AI will help you to generate an essay, why not? I will still need to tweak it, and probably it will be weird if everybody will have the same essay, but it's almost like in the past. You could also copy paste something from the book, or you could just copy it from somewhere. Now AI just gives you copy paste with one click. So
I think it's a great way to sum it up, which is essentially, I'm distilling what you're saying a little bit here, but the tools exist. So use them to your advantage as you can. Like, you don't want to shortchange yourself and, cheat on a homework assignment or something, but if you can use it to accelerate your education, accelerate these other things, why not? It's just another tool in the toolbox. So go ahead and utilize them.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have, everyone. But I just want to say an extra special thank you to everyone, especially people asking questions. We appreciate it. And thank you, Edgar, for the great presentation. It was awesome to have you here. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Cody, to send us out.
Awesome. Randall and Edgar, thank you both so much for joining us today. Randall, I think this might have been the first time we've ever done a man on the street type approach with a webinar. So thanks for being our guinea pig. It might be something we try out in the future. But I really appreciate the both of you joining us today. It's been such a pleasure learning from you over the past hour. A couple of final notes for our audience. Today's session was recorded and we'll be sending it to you via email here shortly, but you can also find it living on the Security Boulevard website. Just visit securityboulevard.com/webinars. I'd like to thank Snyk for sponsoring today's program. I'd like to ask everyone to fill out our survey that is in the chat as well as posted to the handouts. If you fill that out, that will make you eligible for our $50 Amazon gift card giveaway, as well as all of your chats and questions. So thank you for those as well. So Edgar, Randall, thank you both so much. And to our audience, we appreciate you spending your time here with us at Techstrong Learning. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect.